The Pope is returning to basketball Mecca, aka Lexington, and Big Blue Nation is shook.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Good Friday morning to all of you. Andy Patton and Isaac Shade coming to you live. Welcome into this edition of the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. A little more daily than normal because today we've got to react to the Thursday night news of Mark Pope's hiring at Kentucky, which has just gone official moments before we hopped on to do this. That's why we're tapping in. That's Andy Patton. I'm Isaac Shade. You're joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. We want to thank you for making us your first listen or watch. By the way, you can get every episode ad-free on Amazon Music. Special shout out to all of you everydayers out there, as well as the Locked On College Basketball Discord community. If you're not part of it, come join it. The link is in the show notes. Andy, we're going to be talking about everything surrounding this hire for Kentucky. Is this the right hire? Was it too quick? Why not more push on Billy Donovan? What does it mean for BYU? Anything and everything and in between. But Andy, that's where we start. The big news of Thursday night suddenly became Mark Pope was the candidate that AD Mitch Barnhart zeroed in on. We got the news that it sounded like it was going to be made official. Everything was done in principle. And then literally just a couple minutes ago, as we record right now at about 10:20 Eastern time on Friday morning, Kentucky announced it officially. BYU got it out. And that's where we're at. And Andy, as we start in, let me just remind us all, this is all happening because SMU fired Rob Lanier after 2 years. Andy, what do you make of the Mark Pope hire to Kentucky?
I have a lot of thoughts about Mark Pope, and I'm going to get to them in a second, but I wanted to piggyback off that comment about Rob Lanier because this particular coaching carousel has now hit almost every major power conference, and I just find that humorous. We have obviously SMU moving into the ACC, so that has already impacted them, and then you had Andy Enfield replace him. And then Andy Enfield, of course, now in the Big Ten conference at USC. Eric Musselman moves from the SEC to the Big Ten to take that job at USC. Now it's in the SEC. Now Mark Pope moving over to Kentucky. Obviously, Mark Pope and BYU in the Big 12. So I guess that may mean that BYU's next coach is going to come out of the Big East. Just to get every single conference covered. No, if we get some time, we'll get into the BYU coaching search of it all. But just an insane coaching carousel that we have seen. The idea of Rob Lanier getting fired and it's somehow having an impact on John Calipari and Eric Musselman and Mark Pope is just insane that has happened. But this is, and the fact that whole coaching carousel happened when we're not even a week removed from the national championship game. This has been one of the craziest weeks in college basketball. We'll get more into the Mark Pope of it all, but I'll say this. You want a coach who wants to be at your school.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, Scott Drew was waffling on it. Obviously, he ultimately decided to stay at Baylor. Danny Hurley I don't even think he was really waffling. He basically said no amount of money is going to get me to leave UConn and go there.
Because Andrea would divorce me. I think that was
yes. I understand, Big Blue Nation, that this hire was not the name that people had in mind. And I think that Mitch Barnhart did not do his friend and his ultimate coach, Mark Pope, a lot of favors by rushing this hire so quickly after the rejections from Scott Drew and Danny Hurley. There's reports that there was some conversation with Billy Donovan, but it didn't sound like it got very far in that process. I very much understand not wanting to wait for the bowl season to be over, especially if you're just going to wait for a week, 2 weeks, whatever, and then get rejected. You're missing out on transfer portal players. You're missing out on recruits. Like, I understand why Donovan may not have been the way they wanted to go, but to so quickly push Mark Pope through, I think does him a little bit of a disservice in the sense that the fan base right now is pretty frustrated, and there's not a lot of hype and enthusiasm. And I think over time, even through this offseason, maybe that'll kind of taper off a little bit, and people might recognize that a coach who has has had the success that Pope has had, which, yes, the NCAA tournament success is not there. And that fundamentally is going to be something that will be held against him, especially if he doesn't immediately succeed at Kentucky. And it should. He has not won an NCAA tournament game. I understand why that would be a red flag for Big Blue Nation, but this is a coach who is incredibly passionate about Kentucky basketball. He loves this place. I know Jake Hatch, the host of the Locked On BYU podcast, had a quote talking about Mark Pope. I'll see if I can find it. He said that he would, where did that note go?
It's up at the top here.
Well, then that's why I can't find it. I can find the quote from, there it is, from Jake Hatch. Here we go. Pope was willing to crawl over broken glass on his hands and knees for that job. And that's true. That Mark Pope loves Kentucky. He played at Kentucky. He was the captain of the team that won the national championship in 1996. Rick Pitino strongly endorsed Mark Pope for this job. And while it is easy to look at the flaws, the lack of tournament success, the fact that he's been a power conference coach for just 1 year in the Big 12 after they moved. I mean, 2 years ago, Mark Pope finished 5th in the WCC, and now he's the coach of Kentucky. That's a wild sentence to say out loud. But I think that ultimately this is a man who wants to be here, who has a good offensive system, who is passionate about Kentucky basketball. And I ultimately think it may not be in year one, but I think that this is going to be a hire that Kentucky fans are going to ultimately be happy with down the line.
Yeah, and I think that's why Big Blue Nation is so frantic right now, Andy. Like, I woke up to a text from a friend of mine from Big Blue Nation, whom I'll call Brad because that's his name, who just said, well, I'm numb, right? And didn't mean that in a good way, like I'm numb with excitement. And, you know, he said, it leaked on the same day that Danny Hurley turned down $100 million to come. How do you make that jump? And it's those leaps, like Andy, what you were saying about where Mark Pope was just 2 years ago to now. All of this is like this Kentucky basketball. Like I cannot frame my head around Kentucky basketball hiring someone that has never won an NCAA tournament game. But Andy, I just don't see this going the way of Billy Gillespie, right? Like I just don't see that happening. It could, and I know it's not sexy pick. I know it's not a top flight, everyone knows household name, but it just doesn't always have to be that way because, as you said, I really truly think there is something to having someone who loves this place, wants to be here, and desires to do it. He's charismatic enough. Andy, something that I tweeted about on Thursday night, I said, having played for Kentucky, Mark Pope already knows how to navigate the heat lamp that Big Blue Nation will put him under, right? Some people might not be able to navigate that. Some people might not want to navigate that, but Mark Pope already knows it and can do it. And so from that aspect, it makes a ton of sense. He is loved and accepted there. The question is, will it go well? Or will it go as some of the other, I think about other schools who have hired a former player pretty quickly when they didn't get their top candidate after a successful coach. I think of one that jumps to mind immediately is North Carolina hiring Matt Doherty out from Notre Dame after 1 year at Notre Dame following Dean Smith and Bill Guthridge. Right. And that was because Roy Williams turned them down. Eventually they get to Roy Williams, and that's a good thing. But I don't think that this is that same kind of thing for Kentucky. So like we look at the offensive side of it, you said we talked so often this year about how BYU has a good deal of variability because of Mark Pope's offense. But it's funny that a year after John Calipari finally embraced the modernization of the three-point shot, which is hilarious, and then claimed it as hey guys, I just figured something out. If you shoot a bunch of threes, it's modern basketball. Well, of course, we were all there, John, 5 years ago. But Andy, and then Kentucky was number one in the nation in three-point percentage. But now, if that rocked your socks, guess what, folks? Mark Pope's about to blow your mind with what he's going to do with his offense, and obviously we'll talk more about that. But here's a quote from AD Mitch Barnhart. Quote, Mark Pope not only brings an impressive record in 9 years as head coach, but also a love of the University of Kentucky and a complete understanding of what our program means to the people of our state. As a captain on the 96 championship team, Mark was a beloved and respected teammate. As a head coach, he is highly regarded nationally as an innovator. His teams run a unique and dynamic up-tempo offense, and they get after it on defense. He is a strong recruiter with international ties and a person of integrity. Andy, I know an AD is going to say that,
Mhm.
but I don't know how you could get a more glowing recommendation about both the on-court and off-court things that you're going to do. And we can unpack multiple parts of that, both the playing and the person. But Andy, I think just as we're talking about him getting it, him understanding it, he knows what he's stepping into, and I think that's critical.
I think too, like the biggest thing for Mark Pope right now is and for Big Blue Nation really is the recruiting aspect of it, because you're right. He loves this at university. He's got a system, a tempo, everything that I think is really going to work at Kentucky, but he's got to be able to get the players. And Isaac, that's what I want to talk about next. What does this mean in the immediate aftermath for Kentucky in terms of which players are they going to keep? Which players might Mark Pope bring over from BYU? How is this going to work from a recruiting perspective? And I want to talk a little bit more about Mark Pope's offensive set, maybe what the Billy Donovan of this all. We got a lot more still to unpack. And Isaac, we're going to get into all of that. But first, I want to tell you all about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, patience, that's what brings home the winning trophy. And it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Plus, with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, Isaac, let's talk a little bit on the kind of recruiting side for Mark Pope, because I think amongst the lack of NCAA tournament success, which I'm guessing, and just the overall lack of pedigree and fame that comes with hiring Mark Pope, I think that's kind of a lot of the consternation we're seeing right now from the folks in Lexington. But I think from a recruiting perspective, again, we'll reiterate that a coach who really wants to be here, who gets it, who's played at Kentucky, who's been a team captain, who has the support of people like Rick Pitino and so on and so forth, I think that's going to help. I also think that Coach Pope's style is going to help too. And recruiting at BYU is always going to be a little bit difficult. And I think that he did a pretty good job being able to bring high-level talent to BYU. They navigated the transfer portal well. And he had limitations. The move to the Big 12 helped, but that was only 1 year, so we didn't really get to see how much that was going to help him from a recruiting perspective. And so now I'm just really curious in the immediate aftermath of not just long-term what Pope's recruiting is going to look like, but is he going to be able to keep a guy like Zvonimir Visic? Is he going to be able to keep a guy like Onyenso or the recruits, Billy Richmond, Boogie Fland, guys like that? Like, that's the immediate kind of first step that Mark Pope has to do is we're hemorrhaging players over to Arkansas, or that's the concern, at least, is that's what's going to happen. Calipari already brought his whole coaching staff over from Kentucky to Arkansas, which is interesting. I guess we'll just put it that way. I thought maybe some fresh voices might have helped Calipari, but some players are going to follow suit, most likely. And the question for Pope, who has developed bigs very well at BYU, like Fasuni Traore and other bigs, can he keep a Visic? Can he convince Aaron Bradshaw to come back? Does he want those guys in the mix? How is he going to navigate the transfer portal? Those are the things that I'm really curious about with Pope. We heard a report that a booster for Kentucky dropped $4 million specifically for NIL purposes. So Pope's already got some money to throw around. And I'm just really curious how quickly he can hit the ground, starting to piece together a roster here, because the best thing he can do to build up some goodwill with Big Blue Nation is keep some of those guys, or at least bring in some high-profile players right away.
Andy, that's a great point. And I love you making the point also about, look, just because guys are in the transfer portal doesn't mean they can't come back, right? Like, that's a thing to remember too. There is a world in which he could convince Aaron Bradshaw to stay in Lexington. So because remember, he was in the portal, or there were reports, I guess I should say, that he was considering entering the portal even before the John Calipari news happened. So that's a thing to keep in mind. But Andy, here's another thing to think about. Reed Sheppard went from somebody that was like, oh, that's nice. Reed Sheppard, Jeff Sheppard's son, is kind of a legacy. He's coming to Kentucky. He might get in every now and again and have a couple minutes, to oh, this dude's a lottery pick, right? So that's where we sit today, Friday, April 12th. But Andy, here's something else that folks need to be aware of if they're not. Mark Pope, as we've said, was a captain at Kentucky, played there for 2 seasons, won a national championship in 96. You know who else was part of that national championship those times he was there, Andy? A guy named Jeff Shepard, who spent a lot of time in Lexington, Kentucky this year. Why? Because Jeff Shepard is Reed Shepard's dad. And Andy, look, it's not always about these relationships, but I tell you what, they sure do not hurt. Is there a real world in which Reed Shepard says, you know what? I know that I went from kind of afterthought recruit in terms of the Kentucky landscape anyway, to potential lottery pick in the 24 NBA draft. But this guy who my family loves and my dad played with is now the head coach at my school. Is there a world in which that's enough, that relationship, to entice Reed to stay around?
So here's the thing. Reed Shepard probably shouldn't stay in college. Like, I mean, this is a weak draft class, that historically weak. That is the expectation, the kind of the reputation on that draft class right now. Shepard has played himself from a guy who was, we weren't even sure how much of a rotation piece he was going to be, to now being a guy considered legitimately a top 10 potential prospect. It would be really hard to turn that down and risk coming back to school, where you risk not performing as well, where you risk injury, where you risk even playing just as well, but falling in the draft because there's more talented players next year. Having said all of that, Reed Shepard would be a really good fit in Mark Pope's offense. Like, stylistically, the fit, it's not even just the legacy, the connection with his dad, like all that matters. And it matters in a significant amount. And I'm sure Mark Pope, one of the first things on his checklist is to talk to Reed Shepard, talk to the Shepard family, and see what he can do to convince the young man to stay. But I don't think he should. I generally advocate, like, if you're going to be a lockdown first round pick, and especially a lockdown lottery pick, like, you should probably go. But if DJ Wagner transfers or goes to the draft and there's like the guard room is pretty barren at Kentucky, like, I could see Pope being able to sell Reed on, like, you're our guy, you're playing 30 minutes a game next year, like, you're the starting point guard, we're funneling everything through you. And the appeal of getting to stay at Kentucky and play for somebody who's connected to his family, like, it's absolutely there. And I'm really curious if that's a huge splash. Like, you want to, again, we talked about building up goodwill. You want to do that, convince Reed Shepard to stay. And there's some other guys. In fact, our friend Lance Dodd, Locked On Kentucky, just tweeted about 10 minutes ago about some players that he thinks would fit well in a Mark Pope style offense. Top of the list is Reed Shepard, but outside of that, Jackson Robinson, who was the average 14 points per game for BYU last year, really, really good 3-point shooter, really good floor spacer, just a talented overall guard. I'm telling you right now, having seen a lot of BYU and a lot of Kentucky, Reed Shepard, Jackson Robinson backcourt coached by Mark Pope with their floor spacing and 3-point shooting, that's really, really good. And I think if Pope can if he can make that happen, you're going to feel so much better about this hire. And then, of course, if he can keep Zvonimir Visic, that's a big one. Liam McNeely out of high school.
That's one I'm looking at. Yep.
Yeah. If McNeely, who decommitted from Indiana, he's available right now. If Mark Pope can convince him to come to Kentucky, that's a huge potential addition for them. There's Robbie Avila from Indiana State, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as they called him. Like, I think there's a fit naturally there in Mark Pope's offense as well. I kind of, when he first entered the portal, I thought, like, if BYU could find a way to pull that off, that'd be a huge heist for them. A lot of people expect he's going to go to St. Louis and follow his coach, Josh Schertz. But man, if all of a sudden Kentucky's giving you a call, you're going to have to consider that. So there are some ways that Mark Pope can build this roster in a way that fits his style with his NIL money that he now has with the Kentucky brand behind him, where things don't necessarily take a dip in year one and this program's successful right away.
And Andy, I think that's a key thing. Let's remember that this is Kentucky, right? Like, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who the figurehead is as the coach. Guys are going to want to come here because it's Kentucky basketball. You know what I'm saying? If it's not the biggest brand in the sport, it's top 3. And as you're fond of saying, I don't think it's number 3. And so a lot of people could be successful at Kentucky, both in terms of getting guys in and on-court success. And I don't think that Mark Pope is just some guy. Again, because of who he is at the University of Kentucky, because he is a good coach who, we going back to Mitch Barnhart's statement, like that brings an innovative and exciting style. Like people are going to want to turn out to see this thing because it's fun, man. It's a fun style of basketball that BYU has been playing. If you haven't seen it, go watch some highlights. It's wild. And I know it, like there's going to be this whole narrative. Yeah, but they just lost to Duquesne in the NCAA tournament. Sure. Okay, fine. I hear you, but that happens. You know what? Kentucky just lost to Oakland in the NCAA tournament. So it's not like can't go down. But I just think that a lot of people can be successful at a place like Kentucky. And I think Mark Pope is one of those. By the way, Andy, we haven't said much just about how we kind of got here. I think we should probably say a few things about that. And then we should probably talk about where does BYU go, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be able to do all those things in just a second. Right after I tell you that this episode is brought to you by Gametime. Now that the tournament is over, it's time to go take in some MLB games. Maybe it's a last-minute trip or you and a group of friends decide, spur of the moment, hey, let's go downtown tonight and take in a game. Well, great news. Gametime is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Last-minute tickets, check out this feature they have. Save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, but also comedy, concerts, theater, whatever it is. And Andy, I often worry about buying third-party tickets that they might be bogus, but with Gametime ticket coverage, your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. I love that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Andy, this time yesterday, we thought maybe Scott Drew was going to be the head coach of Kentucky. But boy, how things have changed in the course of 24 hours. We get Scott Drew saying no. We get Dan Hurley once again saying no. And I think at that point, all our thoughts and attention turned to Billy Donovan. In fact, you and I recorded a conversation yesterday where we looked at Billy Donovan and we asked the question, do you wait on him or do you have to move? And clearly the answer was you have to move. The machine's got to keep rolling. And I understand that. But let's just put a bow on both Billy Donovan and Rick Pitino because we got some more news on that. And then we can say some words about Mark Pope's contract. So Kyle Tucker from The Athletic tweeted last night, despite earlier reports to the contrary, I'm now told Kentucky did make contact with Billy Donovan, unclear if it was directly or through his representatives this week, and he decided not to pursue the UK opening. Matt Norlander from CBS Sports quote tweeted that and said, to be clear, yes, Kentucky checked in with Donovan's camp, but at no point did UK aggressively pursue or put an emphasis on trying to hire him. The biggest issue from Kentucky's end, per sources, was not wanting to wait until whenever the Chicago Bulls season ends. Andy, you and I had speculated on that, and it turns out to be the case.
Yeah, I don't blame Kentucky for this. My reading kind of on the tea leaves there is effectively what you're alluding to there of Kentucky would have been interested if the timing was going to be right, but the timing wasn't right, and so they kind of checked in. And I think if Billy had said like, yes, I have been told I'm getting let go by the Bulls unless we make the playoffs, and if that happens, I'll take your job right away, then they would have probably been like, okay, yeah, that works for us. We can be a little bit patient in that regard. But that conversation didn't happen, and maybe they got word that Billy would consider it or that he was unsure, and they were like, we just can't wait on that. We just can't afford to do that. And I think they're right. I think they weren't in a position where they were able to do that. The timing of the Musselman move and the Calipari move and everything just put them in a position where they had to be a little bit more assertive in finding a coach right away. And we touched on this already a little bit. And I do think that the speed with which they hired Mark Pope probably didn't do him any favors in the sense that it looks like they glossed over Billy Donovan as a candidate, and Pitino as well. And it sounds like they didn't really seriously consider bringing Rick back. They did speak to him in some capacity because Pitino very, very heartily endorsed Mark Pope as the head coach. He coached him in the 90s, and he basically said, Kentucky, this is a great hire for them. They absolutely need to make this move. And so I think that may have helped Kentucky make the decision. It may help some of the fan base feel a little bit better about the move. And it does sound like there was at least some conversation there, but I'm not surprised that Kentucky probably didn't seriously entertain bringing Rick back. I don't know how seriously he would have entertained leaving St. John's after just 1 year either. So I never thought that was a super serious fit. But yeah, as we had talked about, we thought that if it doesn't work out with Donovan, I think the expectation was they would give Donovan a little bit more time or make a bigger push for him, which it doesn't sound like they did. And after that, the names we were tossing around, Sean Miller at Xavier, Chris Beard at Ole Miss, potentially Buzz Williams at Texas A&M, Bruce Pearl at Auburn. Like we threw all those names out there. We did throw Mark Pope out there as a name as well, but it's pretty clear that those other names were not contacted or considered in any way, and that Pope was the top of that list. And I know that is something that Big Blue Nation is a little bit concerned about, of like, why, like, did we assume that Pearl and Miller and those guys weren't going to take the job? Did we view Pope as an obviously stronger candidate? And as we've alluded to, Pope clearly really wanted this job. And maybe that was enough of a sell of like, hey, we think we can get the money behind you, the boosters behind you, to recruit the way that you need to recruit to make your offense work. And we know that you, as Jake alluded to, will crawl through broken glass to take this job. So that may have just been enough for them. And I honestly, I think that in 3 years, Kentucky fans will be happy that Mark Pope and not Billy Donovan is their coach. And it sounds like a bold prediction, and it's hard because we're probably not going to know what Billy Donovan would have looked like as the Kentucky coach, because he's probably not going to return to college basketball somewhere else. That's right. I think I don't think he's returning to college basketball. And so I think that it probably wouldn't have happened anyway, but I would have had my concerns about Donovan coming in, having not coached in college basketball for 10 years. And you touched on it in our show yesterday, Isaac, that the modern college basketball NIL world actually might make Donovan's ability to recruit a little easier because it's more transactional in nature. And I think that you're probably right. And Billy's obviously a great X's and O's coach. He has experience in college basketball. So there's a good chance that it would have worked. But I'm pretty behind this Mark Pope hire. I don't think it's going to be again, it may not be perfect in year one as he kind of adjusts to that, the prestige of that program and just coaching at a higher level. But the transition BYU went from the WCC to the Big 12 went pretty darn smooth. Yeah. So I have a lot of confidence that Pope's style is going to adjust well. And I think Kentucky is going to be happy with this hire over Billy Donovan. Obviously, they would have rather had Drew or Hurley, and that's totally fine. And Pearl and some of those other coaches may end up having more success over the next few years. But I don't think this Mark Pope hire is going to be this big problem for Kentucky. And I sincerely hope that we're not on freezing cold takes in a couple of years or anything. But like, this isn't going to be a Kenny Payne situation. Like, I think that Mark Pope has the ability to lead this program very successfully in the coming years. And while the way it was done was maybe didn't do him any favors, I think that it's going to work out well.
And Andy, to your point, I mean, with their success in the Big 12 this year, BYU had the same conference record as Kansas this year. Now, albeit the worst year that Bill Self has ever had at Kansas from a conference standpoint, but still, and they won at Fog Allen Fieldhouse. But Andy, that what you're talking about there, here's the question for me. You said like, hey, but at least by year 3, I think Mark Pope has this thing rolling. But here's the question. What kind of year 1 and year 2 does Mark Pope need to have to get to year 3? Because Big Blue Nation is not going to wait 3 years to be Kentucky again. And now we say that, but in the same breath, we also have to say they haven't been to a Final Four since 2015. So there is a level to which they've been waiting. And I think that's just the expectations, also recognizing how hard it just is to get to a Final Four, despite how talented a roster may be. And so obviously that's something we're going to have to continue to reckon with over the coming days and weeks. Is sure, if he can have it up and rolling in a couple of years, great. But in this day and age, especially with the transfer portal, where you can turn over a roster basically overnight, there's not as much, there's not as much grace given. There's not as much leeway or rope extended. And so we'll have to see. Now, even while it might seem to those of us from the outside looking in like this was kind of a quick twitch reaction to the Scott Drew side of things, there was a tweet from Matt Norlander last night that said Mitch Barnhart ID'd Mark Pope as a candidate. Hear me say a candidate, not the candidate for the UK job 3 days ago. So that was tweeted on Thursday. So that would mean Monday per a source. This was not an impromptu decision on Thursday. Pope had a previously arranged meeting with Kentucky for earlier today that was set days ago in the event that higher tier candidates fell through. So Andy, both things are true in that statement, right? Mm-hmm. Like he clearly was not the higher tier candidate, but also he was the person that they chose, that Mitch Barnhart chose, should those higher tier candidates fall through, which it sounds like Billy Donovan was not necessarily one of, that it really was more Scott Drew and Dan Hurley. And then Mark Pope is like the next guy on our list. Now they've fallen to him. And the report on the contract is that they sent him a contract that was a 5-year deal at an average of 5.5 per. And so, Andy, as we look at that, I know you don't necessarily always get your top guy, but we have examples of not necessarily number one choice being successful. And so there is a real world in which Mark Pope is able to do it right here in year one if he can get the right guys in.
Yeah, and I think the fact that his contract, I mean, they offered Danny Hurley twice that, reportedly. They assuredly offered Scott Drew more than that as well. So they save a little bit of money. Potentially they can reallocate that money into NIL or into the
$33 million from John Calipari.
Yeah, exactly. So they have more resources now, which I think really helps them. And in terms of like making an impact early in his tenure in order to not be somebody who gets canned after a couple of years, it's going to come down to tournament success. Like, I think that Mark Pope's going to have enough regular season success at Kentucky. They may not like win the regular season each of the next 2 or 3 years, but Calipari wasn't doing that either. And obviously with Tennessee and Alabama and Auburn and everybody, and now Arkansas is potentially going to be competing at the top there. But they have to have tournament success. They have to make a Sweet 16 in the first 2 years. They probably should make an Elite 8 in the first couple of years in order for there to be more confidence. And that's a little unfair because Calipari wasn't meeting those standards. Now, granted, he ended up getting pushed out because of that, because he wasn't meeting those standards. And Calipari had a longer leash because of previous success. Pope doesn't have that leash and shouldn't have that leash, but he's going to be held to a high standard. He's going to have to succeed right away. And it can't just be in the regular season. And Pope has had a lot of success in the regular season. In fact, in 3 of the last 5 years, Mark Pope's team at BYU has finished higher than John Calipari's Kentucky team at KenPom. Now, he's not going to keep his job because of his KenPom rankings. That's not going to be what keeps Mark Pope at Kentucky. I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying that with extra resources, with more at his disposal, the odds of him being able to keep this program in that top 10, top 15 at KenPom is going to be really good. Now, again, it has to translate to success in the NCAA tournament. There's nothing else. There's nothing else. It has to be that. If they win the SEC 3 years in a row, have a top 3 seed 3 years in a row, and fail to make it to the Sweet 16, he might not be the coach anymore, even with all that regular season success. So I think that's the biggest story right now with Mark Pope is like, you're here. You got the job you wanted. You're excited about it. Your athletic department's excited about it. Your fan base is incredibly skeptical about it. Now you got to build a roster, but you gotta win in March. You have to do that. And I think that's the big thing we're going to be watching for Mark Pope. And then the last kind of part of this conversation, we can get it pretty quickly here, Isaac, is just what this means for BYU, because BYU is now a Big 12 school. Like, they have some resources. They have a huge donor base, fan base. They won 23 games in the Big 12 last year, and now they lose their coach. And the biggest name, and this is something that we've seen written about it, and it's kind of been a part of BYU's history, is that they typically hire coaches for football and their basketball programs who are members of the LDS Church. And Mark Pope fit into that category. And the most notable other coach right now that could have filled that role who fits into that category is Mark Madsen, former coach at Utah Valley, the head coach at Cal last year. However, Mark Madsen very quickly on Twitter Friday morning came out and said, basically, I'm not leaving Cal. I'm happy where I am. I'm happy to help shepherd this program into the ACC. My family's happy here. Like, he made it pretty clear. He made like
it's a long tweet. I'm looking at it right now.
He made a Nate Oates type.
You can't
statement
tweet
of like,
this unless you pay for the upcharge where you can have all the characters. Yeah,
exactly. So he doesn't seem like he's going anywhere. So that puts BYU in a tough spot. I don't know. Like, I read a good article about some coaching candidates, but most of them weren't current Division I head coaches, and it feels like you're a 20-win program in the Big 12. Like, you got to be able to land a coach who isn't coming from the high school ranks or isn't a 5 or 6 year assistant. Like, not saying assistant coaches can't come in and succeed, but I'm a little worried that BYU might be limited in what they can and who they can hire, and that may work for you when you're in the WCC or other conferences, but in the Big 12, like, you got to get the absolute best candidate you can. And I'm curious what direction the Cougars are going to go.
Oh man, Andy, we're going to have to watch that very closely. Going to be interesting. We'll have to talk with our guy, Jake Hatch, whom you mentioned earlier, the host of Locked On BYU. And yeah, I just saw a tweet from Sean Farnham, whom you and I both respect as a great coverer of college basketball, who said, I've been covering Mark Pope since he was an assistant at BYU. It was clear to anyone that he was going to grow into one of the faces of our sport. He is innovative offensively, fiercely competitive, and builds relationships with his players based on accountability and love. And it's just, again, all the right pieces are there. There's some great quotes in our chat here. Like Eric Hart says, only time will tell if Pope is right. The bottom line is, I don't think we could have gotten anybody that will work harder for UK. So there are all these things that are positive. But Andy, I just keep coming back to, like, with that 3-point barrage, what happens like on a mid-January Wednesday night when Kentucky goes 2 of 30 from the 3-point line and loses to Vandy, right? Like that's a very real possibility despite this innovative offense. And so there's just a lot to unfold and a lot to see what happens.
This is the last thing I'm going to say before I'm going to get us out of here today, get us into the weekend. We'll have more conversation about all these coaching carousel hires next week. But Gonzaga and Kentucky agreed to a 6-year home-and-home series 2 years ago. They have played 2 of those games. They have 4 games remaining. It was very curious for Gonzaga fans what this hire was going to mean for that series. Were they going to bring in a coach who was going to be willing to continue the series? Now, Mark Pope obviously has not addressed this yet. That would be a really early question to talk about. I don't see why they wouldn't continue the 6-year series, but the idea that one of the few teams in the WCC that ever gave Gonzaga trouble was Mark Pope's BYU team.
Exactly right.
And then BYU struggled. Again, they finished 5th in the WCC, and they left. And there was a lot of like, okay, we're finally kind of rid of BYU in the WCC. They were a thorn in Gonzaga's side. And now they're like, okay, we're going to play Mark Pope 4 years in a row now in the non-conference, except that he's going to be in blue at Big Blue Nation. It's just kind of a goofy situation. And I know that there's some other scheduling stuff for Kentucky that I'm curious how that will continue in the Mark Pope era, but thought it was funny to acknowledge the Gonzaga and WCC side of it all, because they thought they were done with Mark Pope, and now they get probably 4 more games with him over the next 4 years. Isaac, that's going to wrap it up for us today. Thank you so much to those of you who've jumped in live to hang out with us on a Friday morning. Isaac and I have talked a lot about doing Friday morning live shows, and we're really happy to be able to get this one done for a very obvious good reason with the Mark Pope hire. But we are going to wrap up for the show today. We'll be back next week. We'll continue to keep you updated on the coaching carousel, the transfer portal. I expect this weekend's going to have a lot of movement in Provo and Lexington and Fayetteville potentially.
Aaron Bradshaw just has scheduled an official visit to Ohio State.
Ooh, I like that. That is fun. Yeah, we'll talk about stuff like that. I know Umar Balo's got some visits scheduled as well. Tons of portal stuff coming your guys' way next week. Thanks to those of you who have hung out with us today. Apologies to the lawyer family, as we always do. Let's go Wildcats. They got their guy in Mark Pope. And until Monday, peace.